So in our last video, we talked about, how does the injection work, how does AutoWire work, and what is a component, what is a bean, what is Spring, or what does Spring do in the background. One thing that I would like to clarify here is that this visibility doesn't need to be public. In fact, it can be private. It can even be without any visibility as well. And that's because, Spring has access to those fields anyways, and it doesn't really matter if I expose that field directly or not. But it also means that you can't access that from different classes, which is good, right? Because you don't want any of these auto-wired stuff to be accessible by any different classes. You don't want it to be modified anyways. Unless you want like a runtime change in behaviors and you want to be able to flexibly change things, but maybe that's not the best place to do that. In that case, why not make this into a final variable, right? Because technically you could change this variable's object reference to something else. Who knows who would do that, but usually that's not a good idea, right? And being a defensive programmer, because what can happen will happen, we want to make this into a final field. But we can't really do that in the current setup because what Spring relies on when it does auto-wired is that it's not a final field. A better way to write this would have been, instead of using the auto-wired here, we use a constructor auto-wiring. If I construct this object with this constructor, then this will allow the application to be wired, and this reference doesn't need to be changed because at the construction time, this variable's value enforcement is managed. And same with any other classes here, right? So student service can also have a private field, final, and have this. And by the way, usually if we have only one auto-wired, if we have only one constructor and a bean or a component, we can remove auto-wired because it will know that it's a service, which is a component, and it will know that this class requires an auto-wiring of this field. And if you had different repositories, like say there was like event repository, then you specify that here, and it will try to inject the bean of event repository. So that's how it works. Now that was to you, it's probably more like a visual cleanup, right? So that's fine, but it's also very necessary when it gets to testing. Like when you don't want fields to be modifiable if you're writing a test for that class, because if you know that that field can be changed at any point in the runtime, then that really adds like infinity of possibility of social errors. And while that's not likely to happen, but when you leave a door for something to happen, then it can happen. And that's not what you usually want to have in an application, like unintentional backdoors. So now we go to the controller class, and I'll try to explain like bunch of annotations that I guess you would need to use for your application, because sometimes you want to do things like post students and like maybe it's not a good one for it, but like maybe put students, right? Because you want to change the name for it, and then you want to like give it an ID because you're changing the name of that students class, students object. How do we actually write that? So what better demo than to just show that right now? So if I do a put mapping and I give it a .id, and if I do public response entity and update, say, yeah, let's say a name of student. So here you also want to be specifying like which name you want to change it to. And let's say you're encapsulating that as part of the request parameter. So for example, you might be making a pull request like students ID and slash students ID, and maybe you want to do like name is equal to like whatever you provide. And by the way, like if you haven't noticed already, I think you would have learned from Express anyways, but if you do that, and whatever follows is a query parameter. It's parsable at the controller level. So if I want, for example, a student with an email address of like hajink@gmail.com and change that to like 8, then this is how you would do it. So how do you feed in this part? You actually feed that in by using a request param. And the request param is a string, and you give it the same name as what you want that query parameter to be named in the URL. So, and how do you actually access that ID part? You can also do that by using not a path param. Path param is a different thing. I had a time where I encountered some bugs when I was implementing something and I couldn't figure out why it was happening, but it was because the ID was being fed through path variable, but I was trying to use a path param, which is a completely different thing. So take ID, and if you have a valid one, I think do I need that? Path variable. Okay, cool. Okay, that's how you do it. Yeah. So ID, and there's no. So if I do a command click, then it will lead you to this place because it knows that it's a reference to this path. Now, let's try to update student name, ID and name, and return. Yeah, let's return the updated student. Let's create the updated student, and if I create the method here, I can do student repository and save. Actually, you want to retrieve the student first. So find by ID. And here, you really want to do some kind of validation, right? Because if you don't actually return a student, then, or you couldn't find a student, then you want some way to say that. So you could, I think there are various ways. One way to do that would be to return a null when you return a student, and saying that will imply that the student doesn't exist in the database. Another way is to like raise an exception and do a try catch at the controller level, and then try to escalate that as a like not found exception, not found response code, which I'll try to do here. So I'll do like or else throws. I'm not sure if it's a good idea for me to use let's just do it anyways. Oh yeah, runtime exception. That input, that's a good one. yeah, illegal state exception, and could not find a student with ID or something like that, right? And this will return a student. We'll write this in alternative way, like this is basically the same as, while we're at it, let's just do it in a different way, right? So if I do an optional, student optional, and if student optional is present, you can do whatever you want, like student optional, and do a get. Otherwise, you might want to throw an exception. So yeah, illegal state exception and student with ID does, and then return a student. Let's change the name to update to something like that, and then we do return student like that. But you also want to save that as well, right? So student repository save and students. And if you go back here, you see that. And because this is gonna raise an exception, you also wanna somehow like catch the exception and then return a response entity not found. Yeah, let's catch a illegal state exception. E. And then I don't think not found allows you to specify any kind of body, but if you wanted to like escalate the actual exception message as well, then you want to do a bad request body and give it the message. Now if you try to run this, let's try putting a Postman request for a put. So students, let's say hajink@gmail.com, and name to change it to is, let's say, Michael Jordan. And you see the reason why I didn't put a space between them is because I think you have to do something like that, but let's keep it simple and then do that. Cool. So it says not found. What is not found? Path not found. Why was this not found? I have no idea. Because of the student. Cool. So returned the updated object like that. So now if I try to do a get on the student, then you can see that the name changed actually to Michael Jordan, and that will look the same in the actual database as well. Now, but this is weird, right? Like the way you specify that name to be changed is like, are you sure you want to do that in the query parameter? Probably not, right? So that way you can create a thing called DTO, which is usually a way to specify bunch of attributes. So let's say update name request, something like that. And these information you can supply, and you can supply as like an object from your front end. Like imagine that you wanted to structure your endpoint like students update name, and then maybe the object you pass to it is has the ID of the student and name of the student. Right, so if you go to update name request, you can have a public string like the ID and then ID of the student to change name for, and maybe the other thing could be like name to update to. Yeah, maybe make the variable names clear. So in that case, you actually don't even need this ID. You can just do update name, and you can then give it a request body. Like, remember how the object you pass to the controller is deserialized into whatever request body you specify. So you can do, in this example, like update name request, and it'll be like update name request. And here you can parse update request. Obviously this needs to be ID and name to update to. You can also do some kind of validation, and here, like if update name request ID is null, then you might want to return response entity bad request supply ID, something like that. The student updating a student, something like that. So if you run that, and now if we instead change this to update name, and then we change this to like ID and name to update. I think this was name to update to. Right, and maybe you also want some kind of validation here on name to update to. No, please specify what name to change to, something like that. And then you rerun this application, and say you didn't give like any of these attributes, then it will be like, oh, I don't see anything. Oh, method null now because it's meant to be put, and it will say please apply ID of the student. So like you can do ID, and maybe this will be like Hajin K again. And this will also complain because you haven't specified what name to change to. So this will help you to debug your application, because front end will have no idea what kind of information are needed. And maybe you want to change it to some random string. Name to change to C. So it's not a change to, it's the update to, right? So you send it and it will change it. And if you do a get, then now you can see that it's changed. One thing that you might be wondering at this point is like, how are these like path concatenated? Like, I don't see any of these slashes, right? And the answer is, so there are two components, like the top level class level path component and the method level path component. Class level path component is going to specify that, like every method in this class are specifying like endpoints that are starting with the /student. And implicitly there's a slash here whenever you specify more things. But if you don't specify anything further, then that's going to be where it ends. Post mapping, for example, doesn't specify any further component, path component. And that means the endpoint that it's specifying it for is post student. That's it. Like no slash, just student. And get mapping is also the same. Like it doesn't specify any further path components, so therefore it stays there. But if like it specifies more path component, then it's simply going to be concatenation, so /student and /update name. And if you want to go even further in terms of your path component, then you can do a slash and then do like for example ID, like that. So imagine that you, instead of having an ID in the request, you wanted that ID to be here. Then you will do a path parameter, path variable and then ID, and then you can change all these logics as well. Now, how about the authentication? There are many patterns. Like you can use a header, like basic authentication, and put headers onto the request, and then you can parse that at the controller level and then do that. I initially stuck with the idea of using request parameter. Not sure if it's a good practice or not, but it works and it's been fine. So I can show you how it looks like. So like, for instance, like creating a announcement. Let's go with announcement. Maybe maybe creating an announcement, right? So creating an announcement, you don't want any user to be creating an announcement. You want only the admins to be creating an announcement. And to support that, I created this post mapping that has a /API/announcement. So this will basically map to a post/API announcement and no slash further because there's no more component, part component. And then, this is also specifying that these request parameters can be supplied. So like email, maybe this is equal to like hajink@gmail.com. And remember, with request parameters, you can concatenate those request parameters by this ampersand parameter. So code, maybe your password is like, I don't know, something like that. Then you're specifying the announcement request body. So in that case, you want to like authenticate the user, right? And I had this logic where it just uses those request parameters. So this is one way to do it. Obviously, you can do a similar thing with the headers. But when I was learning Spring, I think request parameter made sense to me, so I just went with that. And from that point on, it just stuck with the whole entire application. Yeah, otherwise, I think cross-origin is straightforward. It's saying that it can be called by any other origins. Yeah, that's all. Thanks for watching.